My name is Elena Marsh, and for 11 years I have made my living in a part of the finance world that most people never think about. I buy mortgage notes. Not houses. Not land. The paper underneath them. The actual debt instruments that banks sell off when they want to clean up their books. It is a quiet, unglamorous business. Nobody makes a movie about the woman who buys distressed commercial notes from regional banks at a discount and collects payments for the next decade. But it pays the bills, and every once in a while, it hands you a story you could not have written yourself. This is one of those stories. It starts, like a lot of neighborhood horror stories do, with a homeowners association. 3 years ago, I bought a house in a subdivision called Aspen Hollow, a pleasant, tree-lined community about 20 minutes outside the city. Good schools, a walking trail, a little pond with a fountain that the HOA was very proud of. I did not think much about the homeowners association when I signed the closing papers. I figured it would handle trash pickup schedules and maybe mow the common areas. I had no idea I was moving into what can only be described as a tiny, self-important bureaucracy with its own police force of clipboard-carrying volunteers. The president of that association was a man named Gary Holloway. Gary had been on the board for 9 years, which in HOA years is roughly equivalent to a lifetime appointment to a small monarchy. He wore a windbreaker with the community logo stitched over the heart, drove a truck with an HOA compliance magnet on the door that he had made himself, and treated every mailbox flag, every trash can left out a few hours too long, and every unapproved shade of exterior paint as a threat to civilization itself. For the first year, Gary and I had no real problems. I kept my lawn mowed, I did not paint my house purple, and I nodded politely at the community meetings I occasionally attended. But in year 2, things changed. I decided to plant a small vegetable garden along the side fence. Tomatoes, peppers, a few rows of lettuce. Nothing wild. Nothing visible from the street, honestly, unless you walk down the side yard on purpose. 3 weeks later, I got my first violation letter. Unapproved landscaping alteration, it said. Please remove immediately or submit for architectural review. I laughed it off, filled out the review form like a good citizen, and waited. 6 weeks passed with no response. Then I got a second letter, this one with a small fine attached, for failing to correct the violation I had already submitted paperwork about. I called the HOA office. I got Gary. Gary told me the review committee meets when it meets, and that in the meantime the fine would stand. That was my introduction to how things worked in Aspen Hollow. I should mention that I did try, more than once, to handle things the reasonable way. After that first garden letter, I went to a community meeting in person, hoping a face-to-face conversation might smooth things over. I brought photos of the garden, printed out on regular paper, and a copy of the review form I had submitted weeks earlier. Gary took the photos, looked at them for about 3 seconds, set them down on the folding table in front of him, and told the room that precedent matters and that if my garden was allowed to stand without formal approval, everyone will think they can do whatever they want. A few of my neighbors nodded along. A few others gave me a sympathetic look that told me this was not the first time they had watched something like this play out. I left that meeting having learned 2 things. First, that the review committee met roughly whenever Gary decided it should meet, and second, that pushing back in public rarely changed the outcome, it only used up an evening. Over the following year, the letters kept coming. My holiday lights were up 2 days past the removal deadline. My garbage bin was visible from the street on a Tuesday when trash pickup was Wednesday morning. A wind chime on my porch was deemed excessive after an anonymous complaint. Each time, a fine. Each time, a deadline. Each time, a threat, however small, buried in the boilerplate language of the letter. Continued non-compliance may result in additional penalties, including liens against the property. I want to be clear that I am not a difficult neighbor. I paid my dues on time, every time. I kept my yard nicer than most of the street. But Gary Holloway had decided, for reasons that I genuinely believe had more to do with boredom and a hunger for authority than with any real concern about property values, that I was a project. Somewhere along the way I had become the resident he wanted to make an example of. The breaking point came in the spring of last year. My elderly father had come to stay with me for 2 months while he recovered from hip surgery. Because he could not manage stairs well yet, I set up a small ramp over my 3 front porch steps. A simple aluminum ramp, the kind you can order online and take down in 10 minutes, meant purely to help him get his walker in and out of the house safely. 4 days later, a letter arrived. An authorized structural modification to the front exterior. Ramps, decks, or other additions require prior architectural approval per Section 4.2 of the Community Covenants. You have 14 days to remove the structure or submit for review. I submitted for review immediately, along with a note explaining the medical necessity and the temporary nature of the ramp. I even offered to have it inspected by anyone on the board. Nothing happened for 3 weeks. Then a fine arrived. Then, 10 days after that, an envelope marked, in large red letters across the front, "Final Notice." I opened it standing in my driveway. It informed me that due to continued non-compliance and disregard for community standards, the board had voted to proceed with a lien against my property, and that if the fines and the underlying violation were not resolved within 30 days, the association would pursue foreclosure proceedings to recover the debt, as permitted under the governing documents I had signed at closing. Foreclosure. Over a ramp for my 78-year-old father's walker. I called my father into the kitchen and read him the letter, mostly because I did not want him to find out about it some other way and start worrying that his stay with me had caused a real problem. He read it twice, handed it back to me, and said something I still think about. "Elena, you deal with people who don't pay their debts for a living. This man doesn't know who he's talking to." I laughed at the time. I did not yet know how right he was. I sat in my car for a long moment after reading that letter, and I felt something shift in me. Not panic. Something closer to clarity. I had spent over a decade in the business of debt and leverage. I knew, better than almost anyone Gary Holloway would ever cross paths with, exactly how serious a word like foreclosure was supposed to be, and exactly how casually he was throwing it around to intimidate a homeowner over a temporary medical ramp. So I did something that I suspect surprised everyone on that board. I ignored it. I did not call. I did not write back. I did not remove the ramp. My father needed it, and it was staying until he no longer did. I let the 30-day clock run. Now, before you think I was simply being reckless, you should know that I was not walking into this blind. Ignoring a final notice is not usually a strategy one would recommend to anyone. But I had a piece of information that Gary Holloway and the rest of the Aspen Hollow board did not know I had. And it changed everything about who actually held the leverage in this fight. About 8 months earlier, in the ordinary course of my note-buying business, I had purchased a small commercial mortgage from a regional bank that was clearing distressed and underperforming assets off its books in bulk. It was a portfolio deal, dozens of notes bundled together, sold at a steep discount because the bank simply wanted them gone. I bought the portfolio, as I always do, and spent the following weeks going through each note individually to understand exactly what I now owned. One of those notes was secured by a small commercial building about a mile from my house. 2,000 square feet, single story, a modest parking lot out front. The original owner had defaulted years earlier during a rough stretch. The loan had been restructured, sold, and resold, the way these things often are, until it landed in the discount bank portfolio I picked up. I remember looking at the address on the note and thinking it sounded vaguely familiar, but at the time I had dozens of other notes to review and did not think much more of it. It was not until months later, sitting in my driveway holding that red-stamped final notice, that I connected the dots. The tenant paying rent every month against that mortgage, the very entity whose payments were quietly flowing to me, was the Aspen Hollow Homeowners Association. That small commercial building was their office. The place where Gary Holloway sat behind his desk, printing violation letters on association letterhead, was a building I held the mortgage on. I want to be honest with you, I did not go looking for this. I did not buy that note to get revenge on my HOA. I did not even know, until that moment, that the two things were connected. It was simply one of those strange coincidences that the world occasionally hands you, the kind you could not plan if you tried. But once I realized it, I understood that I was not the powerless homeowner Gary thought he was dealing with. I was, in a very real and very legal sense, the party whose cooperation his organization depended on to keep the lights on in that office. I let the 30 days pass without responding to the ramp letter. On day 31, as promised, a lien notice arrived, formally filed against my property for the outstanding fines. It was a small amount in the grand scheme of things, a few $100s in accumulated penalties, but the principle of it, a lien threatening my home over a temporary walker ramp, was exactly what I needed. Then I made a phone call, not to Gary, but to the property management company that handled the mortgage servicing for the note I now held. I confirmed, formally, in writing, that I was the current note holder of record on the Aspen Hollow HOA's office building, and I requested a full accounting of the loan's payment history and current standing. Standard due diligence. Nothing dramatic. Just a lender checking on their asset, which any note holder is entitled to do at any time. What I found was interesting. The HOA had been making its payments, mostly on time, but the loan itself had an unusual clause, one that I suspect none of the current board members had ever actually read, because boards change every few years and nobody bothers rereading a mortgage document from a decade earlier. The clause allowed the note holder to call for a full account review and audit of the borrower's financial standing if requested in writing, with a response required within 30 days, and it allowed for a modest increase to the interest rate if the borrower was found to be carrying excessive liability exposure without adequate reserves, something that a foreclosure lawsuit against a homeowner, and the legal costs that come with it, could absolutely trigger. I was not trying to hurt anyone. I want to be clear about that. I did not want to take their building. I did not want to bankrupt a homeowners association that, whatever its flaws, still needed to exist to maintain the pond fountain and the walking trail I liked. What I wanted was for Gary Holloway to understand, in a way that a 30-year-old volunteer with a clipboard rarely gets to understand, what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a final notice. So I sent one of my own. I had my attorney draft a formal letter, on behalf of the note holder, to the Aspen Hollow Homeowners Association, requesting the financial audit permitted under the loan agreement, along with documentation of any pending or threatened litigation involving the association, since that information was directly relevant to the risk review. I attached, for reference, a copy of the lien and foreclosure notice the association had recently filed against a homeowner, me, without naming myself as that homeowner. I simply cited it as a matter that has come to the note holder's attention. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Gary. He did not know it was me at first. He had gotten a call from the association's management company, panicked, asking why the note holder on their office mortgage was suddenly requesting a formal audit and citing a foreclosure action as a risk factor. Someone had pulled the public lien filings, seen my name attached to the property being foreclosed on, and then, presumably, seen my name again somewhere in the note holder paperwork my attorney had not been careful, or rather, had been very careful, to fully redact. "Elena," he said, and I could hear something in his voice that I had never heard from Gary Holloway before. Uncertainty. "Is this? Are you the one who bought the note on our building?" I told him yes. I told him I had not gone looking for it, that it was simply how the numbers had shaken out in a portfolio purchase, and that under any other circumstances I would never have thought twice about it. But given that his board had just spent a month threatening to take my house over a walker ramp for my elderly father, I felt it was only fair that he understand exactly how exposed his own organization was. "Elena," he continued, "the board didn't know. I want you to understand that. I didn't know. If I had known, I never would have." He stopped himself there, and I let the silence sit for a moment before answering, because I think some part of him needed to hear himself trail off before he found the right ending to that sentence. Eventually he settled on, "I would have handled the ramp differently." "You would have handled it differently either way, Gary," I told him. "It was a medical accommodation. It should never have gotten a fine in the first place, mortgage or no mortgage." He did not have much of a response to that, and honestly, I was not looking for one. I was looking for the lien withdrawn and a process that worked for people who did not happen to be sitting on a discounted commercial note. There was a long silence on the line. "We can work something out," he said. I told him I was open to that. I was never interested in punishing an entire community over one man's power trip. But I laid out my terms clearly. First, the lien against my property was to be withdrawn immediately, along with all accumulated fines related to the ramp, which I pointed out again had been a temporary medical accommodation the entire time. Second, I wanted the board to formally review its architectural approval process, because a system where routine requests sat unanswered for 6 weeks before penalties kicked in was not a policy, it was a trap. Third, and this was the one that seemed to bother Gary the most, I wanted the board's next open meeting to include a public review of the association's fine and foreclosure procedures, with homeowners given the chance to speak. He agreed to all of it within the week. I do not think he had much choice. An HOA board that finds out its own office building's mortgage is held by a homeowner it just tried to foreclose on does not exactly have leverage left to negotiate with. The lien was withdrawn 9 days after that phone call. I have the release letter framed in my home office now, mostly as a reminder to myself that patience and preparation tend to beat panic every single time. The community meeting that followed was, by neighborhood standards, a genuine spectacle. Word had gotten around, the way it always does in a subdivision with an active group chat, that something unusual had happened between me and the board. I did not tell anyone the full story. I did not need to. Enough homeowners showed up with their own stack of ignored architectural requests and confusing fine letters that the meeting turned into a full airing of grievances that had clearly been building for years, completely independent of anything I had gone through. The meeting itself ran almost 2 hours longer than scheduled. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Dolores who lived 4 houses down from me, stood up with a folder thick enough to be a phone book and read off a timeline of 11 separate violation letters she had received over 6 years, several of them for issues she said had been resolved and then somehow reappeared on her account a year later. Another neighbor, a younger guy named Marcus who had moved in with his wife the previous spring, talked about being fined for a basketball hoop that had been sitting in the exact same spot in his driveway since before he closed on the house, a fixture the previous owner had installed with what he assumed was approval, since nobody had ever said otherwise until Marcus's name was the one on the deed. By the time the floor opened up for general comment, there was a line of people waiting for the microphone that stretched to the back of the community room, and I remember thinking that whatever petty frustration I had walked in with, it was nothing compared to years of accumulated grievance finally finding an audience willing to listen. To Gary's credit, he did not try to shut the meeting down or cut people off, which surprised me a little. He sat at the folding table with his hands folded in front of him and let most of it happen, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Whether that restraint came from genuine reflection or simply from knowing exactly how exposed his position had become over the previous 2 weeks, I could not tell you. Probably it was some mixture of both. People are rarely only one thing. By the end of that summer, 2 new members had joined the board, replacing volunteers who had quietly decided the position was more trouble than it was worth once actual accountability entered the picture. Gary stayed on the board, to my genuine surprise, but in a noticeably different capacity. He stopped signing letters himself. The architectural review process was rewritten with actual response deadlines. And every fine notice sent out after that summer came with a plain language explanation of the appeals process, something that, as far as I could tell from talking to my neighbors, had never existed in any usable form before. There is one more piece of this story I want to share, because I think it says more about the whole situation than anything else. A few weeks after the meeting, Dolores, the retired teacher with the thick folder, knocked on my door with a plate of banana bread and asked, very directly, how I had known to look into the mortgage on the office building in the first place. I told her the truth, that I had not gone looking for it at all, that it had simply turned up in a routine business purchase months before any of this started. She sat with that for a moment on my front porch, then said something that stuck with me. Funny how the people with the least power in a system are usually the ones who assume everyone else has all the leverage. I have thought about that line more than once since. I still live in Aspen Hollow. My father recovered fully from his hip surgery, and the ramp came down on its own timeline, months after the whole mess had settled, because we no longer needed it, not because anyone forced the issue. The pond fountain still runs. The walking trail is still nice in the evenings. I nod politely to Gary Holloway when I pass him now, and he nods back, and neither of us mentions the letter with final notice stamped across the front in red, though I suspect neither of us has forgotten it either. I think about this whole situation sometimes, and what strikes me most is not the coincidence of the mortgage, strange as it was. It is how easily an organization built to serve a neighborhood can drift into treating the people who fund it like adversaries instead of neighbors, simply because nobody ever pushes back. Gary Holloway was not, I think, a villain in the way these stories sometimes paint people. He was a man who had been handed a small amount of unchecked authority for almost a decade and had slowly forgotten that the people receiving his letters were the same people paying the dues that kept his office open, his fountain running, and, as it turned out, his mortgage current. I did not set out to teach anyone a lesson. I set out to keep a ramp up for my father while he healed. But when you spend your career in the business of debt, you learn one thing very clearly. Paper has power, and most people never bother to read the paper closely enough to know who is really holding it. Somebody had to be the one holding it, in this case. It happened to be me. I have thought a lot, since then, about what would have happened if I had never bought that portfolio of notes, if the numbers had shaken out even slightly differently and that particular building had ended up in someone else's hands instead of mine. My father's ramp would probably still have stayed up, because I was never going to remove it regardless of the fines. But the lien might have stuck. The fight might have dragged through small claims court for a year, costing more in legal fees than the fines themselves ever amounted to, over a piece of aluminum that helped an old man walk safely into his daughter's house. That thought stays with me more than the satisfying part of the story does, honestly. Most people who get a letter-stamped final notice in red ink do not happen to hold the mortgage on the building it came from. Most people just have to pay, or fight, or move, and hope the next board is kinder than the last one. That is really the only lesson I would want anyone to take from this. Not that leverage always shows up when you need it, because it usually does not. But that organizations built to serve a community owe that community more care than Aspen Hollow's board was giving out before that summer. Mortgage or no mortgage, coincidence or no coincidence. I got lucky. Dolores and Marcus and everyone else standing in that line for the microphone did not need luck. They just needed someone, anyone, to finally listen. If you have ever dealt with a homeowners association that seemed more interested in fines than in fairness, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Everyone I know who has lived under one has a story, and most of them are a lot less strange than mine, but every single one of them is worth telling. Thanks for listening to this one all the way through.